The drug cold chain during the pandemic is the topic of my conversation today with Paul Dickson. He is president of Morris Dickson, a wholesale pharmaceutical distributor. Paul, welcome.
Thank you.
Paul, what is remdesivir anyway? I mean, just give us a quick brief on what that drug is.
Well, it is made by Gilead, and it's a bio in the biopharma category. The liquid solution is a cold chain product. There is a powder that is not cold chain. This particular drug has been indicated for COVID-19 therapy, and it has been authorized for emergency use. And Gilead donated the supply, which it had in the late spring, and is now producing and selling that product at a market price that it established. And we are an authorized distributor for Gilead, so we distribute all of Gilead's products.
Okay, describe, however, the challenge of distributing this particular drug, which I believe is just about the only antiviral drug that has shown any effectiveness at this point with respect to COVID-19. But what are the challenges with regard to getting adequate supplies and getting it distributed on a wide basis?
Well, I wouldn't be able to speak to Gilead's supply. That would have to come from Gilead.
I mean, just from your standpoint, right, as a distributor.
The donated portion was donated to the government, and so HSS, United States government. So HSS actually arranged for it to be received. So it did not go through the usual supply chain. Mm-hmm. It was instead the national distribution was handed by HSS to AmerisourceBergen Corporation, who then shipped it to the states. And there was an allocation to the states done by HSS based on the number of hospitalized COVID patients in the states. Mm-hmm. I would say the challenges weren't to a distributor like Morris Dickson or AmerisourceBergen. The challenge was that the HSS was shipping to 50 different state, mostly health departments, many of whom did not have experience or capabilities in supply chain, nor necessarily the refrigerated capability. We received a request from the state of Louisiana, that is the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals, to assist them in distribution, which we did. Mm-hmm. That is the extent of my knowledge. I know that neighboring states did distribute that within their state health system. I know that Texas distributed it within their state system. But for Louisiana, we transported that product from the receiving point to the DHH, Louisiana DHH, to our facility so we could put it in the proper cold chain. And then we distributed that to Louisiana hospitals in our normal fashion.
Well, were there adequate supplies of the drug? Wherever
it
was
allocated.
Needed.
It was allocated.
You say allocated, but what does that mean in terms of is there enough to go around
ration,
where it's needed?
Right. It means rationed. It means there was not as much remdesivir in stock in March and April and May as was being called for, because it wasn't a drug that was being readily used. There wasn't a high demand for it, and then it was determined that it worked for COVID-19. Gilead then had to allocate, as we call it, or ration the stocks that it had. It didn't wish to make that decision itself as a company, so it donated that product to the Department of Health and Hospitals, and they made the decision of which state would get how much. Within the states, each state Department of Health made the decision, the allocation decision of which hospitals would get how much.
I see. Now, as I understand it, however, you are proposing some form of public-private partnership to ensure proper coordination of the distribution of this and maybe other drugs as well, and to address challenges like the inability of some of these recipients to properly handle storage and further on distribution of the drug. Tell me a little bit about your idea and how that might improve the cold chain of this particular drug.
Well, my idea is not at all unique or created. And the fact the public-private partnership term is a term that was issued by used by the HSS and FEMA and a request for proposal that we did respond to. Our suggestion is to distribute the COVID drugs exactly like we distribute everything else. We have a very effective drug supply chain in the United States.
Mhm.
It was very effective so far in COVID. I'm not referring to the personal protection PPE supply chain. I'm referring to the pharmaceutical supply chain. The pharmaceutical supply chain worked very well. It's robust. It's well connected. I believe that that not only remdesivir, but vaccines and further COVID treatments that are developed will best be distributed by the existing supply chain. Just put it in the usual commercial channel and it will best be distributed. If we try to step outside of the system, we're reinventing a supply chain that works quite well. And I don't understand why there would be proposals to step outside the supply chain. The number of dosages involved in a vaccine certainly are much greater than in influenza vaccines, but it's still within the scope that the existing drug supply chain in the United States can handle quite well.
Well, it's gratifying to hear you say that the particular distribution supply chain worked well, because it sounds like just about nothing else has during this pandemic. So I guess that's a bright spot. But also, I mean, this was a drug, remdesivir was a drug that existed before for other antiviral applications, correct? It was on the market.
Right. It was on the market.
So
it had limited usage.
So all of a sudden, it comes under huge demand. Are you saying that you were able to fulfill that sudden huge demand that was rather unexpected?
As I said, the demand was greater than the supply. And when we speak of supply chain, I can only speak as a distributor, not as a manufacturer. Okay, the manufacturing capability is Gilead's area. I can speak for the distribution, which is what my company does, as I am speaking only for distribution in terms of vaccines or any other drugs. As a distributor, we certainly are capable of distributing the market share that Morris Dickson has. I can't speak for the three major drug wholesalers, but I've heard nothing to differ. I believe that they are capable of, as well as some of the other smaller distributors, would be capable of managing the market share of existing pharmacies that they have and institutions that they supply today, and supply those with any COVID drugs that come through, vaccines or otherwise.
But tell
we're
me
all
if you're
perfectly capable of doing
Tell
that.
me if your role in this particular distribution challenge was in any way different from what you've done before. Like, take, for instance, the state of Louisiana. As I understand it, you worked with the state of Louisiana to help them to choose where products are shipped to and in what quantities, and what are the criteria for who receives that drug in the most effective way. Did you not play some kind of a role in that way, or is that just your typical role that you always do?
It is a typical role for a distributor. And early on in remdesivir, and before remdesivir, when there was a run on, there was a great demand for the was commonly known as Z-Pak and hydroxychloroquine. When there was a great demand for that, we did manage the allocation of that, because in the case of hydroxychloroquine, there was a considerable existing need that with autoimmune deficiency patients such as lupus that needed to continue to receive that drug. Meanwhile, there was a great demand. We had to balance that, and we set up algorithms that we have existing now that flag when there is a run on a drug, is to use the common retail example of the toilet paper. Okay. Had we been distributing toilet paper, we would have identified the run on it early on, because we would have sudden orders. And at that point, we then establish allocation algorithms. Now, in the case of hydroxychloroquine or in the case of remdesivir, we don't make pharmacological decisions. We're a distributor. We turn to the Louisiana Board of Pharmacy in that case, and they consulted with some medical schools, and they came up with some criteria that allowed us to best allocate the hydroxychloroquine where it needed to go. And in the case of remdesivir, early on, now, very shortly after remdesivir began used, Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals took over that decision making.
I see.
And they did work with the Louisiana Board of Pharmacy. And this is in the state of Louisiana. I think other states took a similar path. They have their, the state health departments usually work well with the controlling boards like a board of pharmacy, and we'll have their in-state experts, and we'll have councils of users such as the hospitals, HFPA, and those other type entities. So those tend to set the pharmacological or patient demand criteria. A distributor doesn't do that. A distributor just distributes where where it's ordered by those authorities.
What I'm interested in, what you mentioned, is you have this allocation algorithm that you spoke of. That's yours, right? That's your determination.
And that's going to be based on where we've seen it before. In other words, if you have a drug that a particular set of retail pharmacies has never ordered before, but this drug goes to hospitals or goes to certain specialty pharmacies, and suddenly you're getting orders from entities that have never ordered it before, and it's in short supply, you're not going to send it to those places. Instead, you're going to stop it, and you're going to send it pro rata to the places that purchased it before. That's in a simple term.
So historical, it's based on historical consumption. It's nothing magic. I mean, these days when we hear the word algorithm, immediately we start thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and things that humans are not even capable of doing. This is something I guess you've had in your back pocket for a long time.
Well, yeah, algorithm is really just means a formula. Put in a computer. That's all it is.
We shouldn't be too dazzled by the word then, in other words.
It's just a formula in a computer. And you might adjust that algorithm if, in fact, say, the Board of Pharmacy or the Department of Health comes in and gives you criteria. And then you just plug their criteria into your formula so that it's distributed to where they wish to see it go.
Yeah. Now, Paul, I mean, you're really making this sound like it was business as usual for you folks, and certainly that may very well be the case, but are there any lessons that you learned from this particular experience that you can take forward with you in the future in terms of your role as a distributor?
Well, I think all distributors have to fine-tune their ability to respond. And as I said, you can get these sudden demands in product, and sometimes it isn't sudden, sometimes it ramps up. These are all just inventory management, and as this is a supply chain publication, that's integral to supply chain management, is to not only be able to develop systems that smoothly handle everyday demand, but systems that identify other than normal demand and respond to them. And so I think all distributors are, particularly in this environment we're in now, fine-tuning their daily order management such that you can identify these trends. And we've responded to a lot of different types of emergencies. We've responded to man-made emergencies such as plant explosions in oil refinery sites. We had responded to a community where there was a fertilizer plant explosion, where suddenly you had a lot of trauma patients, a large number. We've responded to hurricanes, and now we respond to this pandemic. And the one lesson we learned from them, and this really speaks to the issue of a strategic national stockpile, it's very difficult to predict what drugs will be needed in a given crisis. And this is the fallacy, frankly, of a large centralized national stockpile, is will they stockpile the right thing? Not likely, because there's 30,000 different pharmaceutical items. Identifying which and how much of one that's going to be needed is just very difficult to do. And if I go back into hurricanes, frequently in hurricanes, what you're really dealing with is people that are displaced, and suddenly their normal needed blood pressure medicine, their normal everyday prescriptions, they suddenly need in a different place. And that may be hundreds of thousands of people. And so suddenly the demand shifts on very routine medications as opposed to a sudden need for trauma supplies. Or in the case of pandemic, who would have guessed hydroxychloroquine? Who would have guessed remdesivir? No one would suddenly be needed. So this is why we advocate the use of the existing supply chain. And if the government feels that it wants to see additional stockpile of certain drugs, that can be done very smoothly within the existing arrangements between drug manufacturers and drug distributors, that these additional supplies, these additional inventories can be held by distributors and also can be rotated in the supply chain, as opposed to a static stockpile where it sits on the shelf and goes out of date.
Well, it sounds like an incredible challenge that you guys face every day, but it also sounds like you're doing a really good job of meeting it. And here's hopes that that will continue in the future. But in the meantime, Paul Dickson of Morris and Dickson, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Thanks a lot for being with us
Thanks
today.
again. Thank you for the interview.